Howdy, this is Lemmy with RevZilla TV, here to talk to you today about how to winterize your motorcycle. Now, if you should live in SoCal or Florida, I have a mental picture of you. Right now, you're watching this on your tablet, poolside, you're rubbing coconut oil into yourself. Just stop watching this video. Move on to Anthony's next graphical helmet overview. For the rest of you who actually have to deal with winter conditions though, you probably put your bike away for at least some portion of the winter. If you properly winterize the bike, that is get it ready for putting into storage, you'll have a bike that is ready to run the first nice day of spring, or even one of those nice warm winter days when you can sneak a ride in. There's a lot of ways to do this, but this is the RevZilla checklist. Follow this checklist and we're gonna make sure that you have a bike that's ready to rock and roll come nice weather. Now, the first thing I like to do when I'm getting ready to winterize a bike is go take it for a ride. It does a couple things for you. As the weather gets colder, most of us don't ride so much, so there's water and there's contaminants in the oil, and the heat from running it around will help drive off some of that water. It'll also get your chain hot. If you happen to have a chain drive motorcycle, it'll make lubricating the chain easier. That's something you also want to do before storage. After I've got a ride taken though, the first thing I like to get into as far as the actual winterization steps is dealing with the fuel. Now, there's a couple ways to skin this cat. Some people like to drain the fuel system out entirely. Drain the tank, drain the carbs, that way they figure there's nothing in there that can gum up the carburetors. And that's a valid way of doing things. A lot of bikes nowadays though are fuel injected, so they don't have it petcock. There's not an easy way to get the fuel out of the tank, short of removing the tank and actually physically emptying it out through the top, or perhaps pumping it out with a fuel pump. That's super inconvenient. So rather than try and empty that out, what I'll do is the exact opposite. I'll fill up with fuel. Now, when you fill up a tank with fuel, you're doing a couple things. You're driving off airspace. There's no more airspace actually inside the tank. And you're also driving off the possibility of water. Because you have fuel vapor in there, it really doesn't give water much of a chance to form. Water and oxygen really are the things that wind up causing fuel to go bad and get a little gummy. So at that point, I also like to treat the fuel. Especially with modern fuels, they have a lot of ethanol in them. Ethanol really is goofy stuff. It winds up separating, believe it or not, into its component parts in a tank if it's left to sit for long enough. By treating the fuel a little bit, what that does is keeps that stuff from happening. You don't get that goop, you don't get grossness and yuck. So what we do is add a little bit of treatment to the fuel, and now this thing is topped completely up. So there's no air in this tank, and it's also treated. So we don't have to worry about fuel gumming things up. An important thing to remember for those of you who ride all the way through the winter is that you're going to want to retreat your fuel every time you bring the bike back in. So one of the things I like to do is mix up a can of pre-treated fuel and I leave it right next to my bike. So if I do sneak out for a winter ride, I can top that thing up with the already treated fuel and not have to keep going through the hassle of filling it up with fuel and then retreating and then running the bike. Now, before I do get into the next step, I am going to run this motorcycle for just a moment. The reason I'm going to do that is going to get this treated fuel moving through the fuel system. It's going to get through the intakes, it's going to get through the injectors, and now that protected fuel is going to be all the way through the fuel delivery system. Before I do that though, I am going to mix myself up a drink. Peppermint schnapps and hot chocolate make a kickin' ski lift. Ooh-wee, that is some high-octane hot chocolate. This is the stage of the game where it's time to get your hands dirty. If this was not a Harley, it did not have a belt, now is the time when I would be washing and waxing the chain on this motorcycle. Because this thing is still warm, the heat on the chain is actually going to help draw in the lube. It's going to help the lube work its magic on the plates of the chain, get in between the links and the O-rings and the rollers. So the first thing you want to do with this thing is get the chain lubricated on if you have one on your motorcycle. Again, that lubricant working its way in there is going to be the most effective way to get your chain lubricated and protected from salt and rust from the winter time. The other things you want to consider are replacing some fluids. Now, if you're riding your bike through the winter, you're going to do your maintenance as usual. But if you're putting your bike up for a little while, you're going to want to get the fluids out of your motorcycle. This can include your engine oil, your primary fluid, your transmission. These can all take on water, moisture, all sorts of mung and dirt, just really gross stuff that's going to be held up against your expensive internal engine and transmission components. So rather than having acids and contaminants up against that stuff, get that stuff out of the bike. Replace your fluids. Something to consider too, especially for those of you riding liquid-cooled bikes. Get that coolant out of your radiator. It's very easy for radiator coolant to go acidic. And when it's acidic up against that thin aluminum of your radiator, or perhaps some of the other delicate aluminum parts in your cooling system, you'll wind up having an acid eat a hole into some of your motorcycle parts. It's not really a great thing for anybody. Also something to consider too, if you happen to have a shafty bike, you want to drain and refill that rear end. It's not a difficult job, and Spring You will thank Winter You for not being lazy. If you're putting your bike away for a real Siberian deep freeze, one of the things you may want to consider is fogging the cylinders. Now, fogging the cylinders is basically the act of lubricating the very inside of the motor. And the way we do that is by removing a spark plug or two, and we're going to use this stuff called fogging oil. And fogging oil is effectively a very heavy lubricant, except that it's aerosol. So what that means is once we get this into a spark plug hole, and we give it just a little bit of a spritz here, what that's going to do, because it's an aerosol, is lubricate, but it's going to be a cloud of lubricant inside your engine. So it's going to protect the very internals, the really expensive, hard to get to stuff inside of this. Now, I'm not trying to sell you anything, so if you're a little bit short on coin and you can't spring for fogging oil, a couple tablespoons of plain old motor oil will do almost the same thing without the aerosol action. Again, it's something you want to think about if you're definitely not going to ride your bike through the winter and you're going into a real Siberian deep freeze. It might be 6 or 8 months before you wind up getting this thing up and running again. Now, from this point, I'm going to do this other cylinder, and then from there, I'm going to wash and wax this bike. Now, the reason I'm going to wash and wax it is because as stuff builds up in a bike, as you ride around, you get road dirt on there, you get a little bit of grease, maybe you have some bird crap on there. It's really hard on the finishes of your motorcycle. What washing is going to do is remove all that stuff. You want to use a nice bike-specific wash. It's not going to be harsh on any of the finishes, and it's not going to strip down any wax you have actually on your motorcycle for the time being. So the washing is going to remove all of that stuff, and then what you're going to want to do is dry it off real well so you don't trap any moisture, and then wax over the top of it. And what wax does is actually helps seal in the finishes on your bike. Most of the beautiful parts of your bike, the chrome, the paint, perhaps polished aluminum like our wheels up there, are pretty delicate surfaces. So if we get them clean and then we dry them off and we seal them up with wax, we make sure a couple things. First, they're going to look good come springtime, but secondly and most importantly, if you do happen to zip this thing out during the winter, that wax is going to help to repel some of the salt water, because a lot of salt is on the roads during wintertime. It's going to keep the bike from corroding, and it's going to keep the bike looking good. You don't want to have a rusty, terrible bike simply because you didn't take care of it during the wintertime. Nobody wants that. So at this stage, like I said, I'm going to finish up this last jug, and then I'm going to go get my wash and wax on. As you can see, this bike is much cleaner, and I am far dirtier. Now's the time where you're going to want to give some serious thought to where your bike is going to end up for its winter nap. I know that there's a wide variety of places people will stash a bike. I've seen them from everything from Cadillac heated garages all the way down to stuffed in a back alley somewhere. Some people use sheds, garages, whatever's handy works. Covered is usually better than uncovered. When I was in college, I had a couple motorcycles live in my bedroom. My girlfriends hated it, but my motorcycle sure loved it. So as you can see here, I do have this seat off on our Street Glide. I was installing an SAE cable onto the battery. What that allows us to do is to hook up a battery maintainer or a float charger for easy access. Rather than having to take the seat off every single time and use alligator clips, what we can do is run that lead somewhere convenient, zip tie it down, and then it's easy to just hook up the maintainer very quickly to the motorcycle from now until the time you're done with that motorcycle. It really does make things convenient. The other thing I really love about having an SAE lead on a bike is this thing. This is an adapter to go from SAE to coax, and coax cable is actually what most heated gear runs on. The reason I like that is because I can sneak my bike out for a winter ride. I can unplug the maintainer, go for my ride, come back in, unplug my heated gear, which I've used with the coax adapter, and plug the battery maintainer right back in. It's very quick, and I can usually get it done before Old Man Winter knows I even snuck out for a ride. I really dig that. So at this stage of the game, you're really drawing to the end of your particular winterization. So one of the things I like to do if I'm keeping a bike indoors is to go ahead and condition the seat. Cold really takes its toll on vinyl. It can really crack it up. So when you use some vinyl protector, a little bit of rag, work that in here, that can give a little bit of suppleness, some flexibility to the vinyl, and it ensures that you're going to have a nice, supple seat come springtime. When it's time to actually jump on and ride again, you're going to have a seat that is in good shape to do so. Now from there, one of the other things a lot of people like to do is throw something underneath the tires of the motorcycle. A lot of people use cardboard or perhaps some old carpet squares. I don't personally do this. I don't feel like it's necessary, but there's enough people out there doing it that it is something to consider. I guess the theory is that the moisture in a lot of concrete floors can't come up. The cardboard or carpet, what have you, acts as a moisture barrier to keep those delicate painted and polished chromed surfaces from being destroyed by moisture. So if it makes you feel good to do it, the investment of a couple pizza boxes really isn't a great one. Something to consider. At this stage, I'm going to plug in the tender, cover this bike with something nice and soft to keep any dust from accumulating on the motorcycle. I'm pretty much done for the winter if I'm going to keep the bike indoors, as this one will be stored. Now, not everybody has the luxury of a shed or a garage. Some of you folks live in the city. Maybe you don't even have an alley to stash your bike in, and you're leaving it right on the street. That's fine too, but you might want to approach things a little bit differently. We talked about the seat and the battery. Because the cold really does affect those two items probably worst on a motorcycle, I like to take those inside if I'm not able to store the bike indoors. Again, that warmth will keep this vinyl from going all hard and cracky, so you'll have a nice looking seat come springtime. And then with the battery, what I'll do is actually remove it from the motorcycle and bring it inside and hook it up just with alligator clips that come with most float chargers to keep the battery up to snuff. That way you're not running long cables all the way out to the street where people can tamper with them, or perhaps they get unplugged, pulled, broken, etc. Once you've got that done, it kind of counterintuitively, unlike the guy keeping his bike in his garage, you might want to think about not covering your bike. And the reason I say that is because a cover can actually act as a sponge. It'll soak up all sorts of salt and grossness, but especially moisture, and it will lay it up against parts of your bike that you don't want moisture being against. And moisture that's laid up against paint for an extended period of time can soften the paint, and if it's up against aluminum surfaces, it can wind up corroding or oxidizing the aluminum. So even though it doesn't sound like a great idea, you may actually want to consider leaving your bike stored without a cover on it. Even though it might look terrible seeing your poor baby outside covered in snow, that may actually be the safer way for it to spend its winter. So at this stage of the game, regardless of whether you are keeping your bike inside or you're leaving it outdoors, you're pretty much done winterizing. The only thing left for you to do is to keep clicking on some of our other how-to videos and perhaps put together another motorcycle for you to use in the springtime. All that having been said, I'm Lemmy. Thanks for winterizing your bike with us. I'm out of here.